His Excellency, Rwanda's ambassador to the United States, Engineer James Kimonyo, members of the Rwandan team, the Rwandan embassy team in Washington, D.C., members of the permanent mission of Rwanda to the United Nations in New York, who are here with us tonight, distinguished guests, friends of Rwanda, fellow Rwandans. It gives me a great honor to introduce Mr. Carl Wilkens, our keynote speaker this evening. I want to begin by just giving a little background about Mr. Wilkens. As a humanitarian aid worker with the Adventist Church, Carl Wilkens moved his young family to Rwanda in the spring of 1990. When the genocide against Tutsi began in April of 1994, Ms. Wilkens refused to leave, even when urged to do so by close friends, his church, and the United States government. In the end, Ms. Wilkens was the only American to remain in Rwanda, though thousands of expatriates were evacuated and the United Nations pulled out most of its troops. Venturing out each day into dangerous streets, crackling with gunfire, Mr. Wilkens worked his way through the roadblocks of blood-stained soldiers and civilians armed with machetes and rifles in order to bring food, water, and medicine to groups of orphans who were trapped around Rwanda's capital. In the end, his actions saved the lives of about 100 people. In the aftermath of the genocide, Mr. Wilkens and his wife Teresa, who we are also honored to have here this evening, founded an education nonprofit called World Outside My Shoes. And they travel full-time telling stories from Rwanda and inviting people to enter the world of the other. Mr. Wilkens also recently wrote a book entitled, I Am Not Leaving, which I encourage all of you to read at some point. Ladies and gentlemen, I can go on and on about Mr. Wilkens' humane and inspirational actions during one of man's darkest period. But I want to end this introduction by saying a word about what having a man like Mr. Carl Wilkens means to survivors of the 1994 genocide against Tutsi, like myself. In those dark times, when we watched as our neighbors and former friends turned against us, as we watched as our fathers, mothers, siblings, and countless family members were being butchered simply because of being of the Tutsi ethnicity, a characteristic that they had neither chosen nor could change. We still wanted to believe that good still existed somewhere in the world. And in the aftermath of the genocide, when many survivors, when we struggled not to lose our faith in humanity, knowing that a man like Carl Wilkens existed in the world, rescued us from hopelessness, and helped us to believe once again that even in a world where so much evil is allowed to happen, great good can still be done. One of my favorite quotes by Edmund Burke reads, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for the good man to do nothing." Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Carl Wilkens is a good man, a great man in fact, and I'm confident that if there had been more Carl Wilkens in Rwanda in 1994, perhaps some, if not all of us here, will still have our fathers, mothers, siblings, and other members of our families who we lost during the 100 days of the genocide. So, Mr. Wilkens, we want to thank you for reminding us of the importance of being our brother's keeper, for letting us know that even in the worst of circumstances, even in an environment of great danger, there is always a choice to do good. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Carl Wilkens, as he gives this evening's keynote speech. Thank you.
For 88 nights during the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi, I slept in the hallway of my house. And I developed a routine. I would make sure I knew where I took my shoes off and placed them, because never knowing what would happen in the night, you wanted to be able to grab your shoes quickly. I had a little bag of a few things I considered essential near me. And of course, as many of you know, the electricity was long gone, and so I had that little candle. So I would go and blow the candle out and lay my head down. And some nights I would remember, whoops, I forgot. I made a promise with my wife when we said goodbye that every night before going to sleep, wherever we were, we would each read Psalm 34. Tonight I'd like to read that with you, and where Teresa is, she'll join me with music. I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let's exalt his name together. Some of us resonate with those words, and some of us say, are you serious, God? But the guy who wrote these words, the womanizer, the warrior, the man who chased after the heart of God, well, let's read on. He says, I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all of my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. Come, my children, listen to me. I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongue from evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil and blot out their name from the earth. The righteous cry out, and I'm sorry for the question mark in my tone, but the righteous cry out and the Lord hears them and he delivers them from all of their troubles. Are we serious? The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all of his bones. Not one of them will be broken. Evil will slay the wicked. The foes of the righteous will be condemned. The Lord will rescue his servants. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. We've been on quite a journey for the last 18 years. Mr. Ambassador, my brothers and sisters, Yvette, Stephanie, all of you who worked so hard to pull this evening together, it's been a journey. We thought that moving through 3 months of genocide was something that was just impossible to do, but some survived. And we've wrestled with God over these years. Some of us choosing to turn our backs on him, others of us saying, no, even though he kills, I'm going to trust and I'm going to hang on. We're here on April 7. Some are calling it Passover, the slaughtering of the firstborn and the deliverance of others. For some it's Easter. They believe that their Savior was in the grave this day, figuratively, the Easter weekend. And some who we often neglect, and we even call them dark, from a Christian community. In the Zen Buddhist tradition, they call April 7 the day of mindfulness. Mindful that your joy and your sorrow is our joy and our sorrow. For me, I have many questions for God. And yet I've also decided that the things I know about God, I will not throw out in exchange for the questions and the confusion that is still with me. I will hang on to what I know. The bones that were broken, you read through this psalm and you see all kinds of words like brokenhearted and crushed in spirit, delivers them from their troubles. And you know, keep your tongue from evil and telling lies. And you realize that, bless you. Now I got to leave the microphone for a minute. And you come to realize, well, Mark Vader, some of you will remember Mark Vader. He was a Frenchman who said, no, I'm not leaving. When all the foreigners were leaving, Mark had those, I think only around 12, only? Wow, did I just say that? Mark had around 12 orphans in his home in Kigali. His house was just below Siashka. Some of you will remember his story. It was actually Colonel Renzaho who directed me to his house 3 weeks after the genocide began. Mark, this man with long hair and long beard, je ne quitte pas, I'm not leaving. It was unthinkable for Mark to leave those orphans. And as the months went on and Mark and I became closer and closer, you know what Mark said to me? As you said in the introduction, what Mark said to me as I was working to bring food and medicine and water to orphans to Mark's group, Mark's house took a mortar. Fortunately, nobody was seriously injured, so he moved to the basement of St. Michel's. Boy, it was right there at the parking lot of St. Michel's when the RPF took over the city and I met together with Tito again. We had met up there at Mulindi earlier before the genocide. We were in this process of rebuilding. We were so optimistic. We were so hopeful. These Arusha peace accords, and we'd had 3 years of this war and suffering and people in the displaced camps, and we were getting ready to rebuild the health centers there so people could go home. And we met with the RPF, we met with Christina, and people were suspicious, and you know, all of those things were happening. And I remember the night we met Christina's grandma. She hadn't ever seen her. She'd been born outside of Rwanda. Grandma was born in Rwanda. Those family reunions that everybody was anticipating, and then all of that snatched away. And it could have been stopped. And Ambassador, you ask about the international community? I'm the international community. The international community is not just somebody out there in some nebulous place. The international community is not just some people with maybe a lot of money and means. We're not talking about the privileged community. We're talking about a global community. People from every nation. And in Rwanda, we failed. But Mark said to me, we were probably getting into the month of June by now. And Mark said to me, you know, Carl, it's strange what's happening. the things that we see are becoming less real to me. And the things that we can't see are becoming more real to me. And I thought about those texts, that one I'd been reading every night in Psalm 34. Man, was David talking about something more permanent than these bones of mine that get old and eventually die? Was he talking about something much more permanent than the things we see around us? Can I live with a vision that there is something eternal, something that I can hang on to, something that nobody can snatch away from me? Teresa and I moved to Rwanda when we were still kids. I was 32. We actually met in high school. I took her to Zimbabwe in 1981 as my bride when she was 22 and I was 23, and our daughters were born in Zimbabwe. There was this UN soldier who stayed, that small group of soldiers who stayed in Kigali. What's his name? Captain. And I met him in the Milcolene Hotel, and he was from Zimbabwe. And as soon as he found out that our daughters were from Zimbabwe, we were instant friends, you know. We talk about the deniers. It was about the second week of the genocide that I got this idea of talking on a cassette recorder to record what was happening around me. I honestly didn't know if I was going to survive this dark time. And if I didn't survive, I wanted to leave something for my wife and our 3 children. Perhaps hearing me tell stories would remind Teresa why we both decided that I should stay in Rwanda. Maybe the stories would help our children understand something more of their dad. Above all, I wanted these stories to help the 4 of them know that I really did love them more than anything else. I had no idea when I was recording these cassette tapes and writing Spokane, Washington, my address on each tape in case I was killed and in case our house was looted, somebody might find this cassette tape and send it to its intended destination. I had no idea that years later I'd finally, thank you, Immaculée, finally write this book. Immaculée's been on me for years. Carl, write the book. And so finally last year I got those old tapes out. And put, basically based on 8 hours, put the book together. But it's not that I had no idea about a book years later. It's not that I had no idea that I'd get the opportunity to travel around and share stories. Teresa and I are just back from 4 weeks in China. We were meeting with Chinese students, talking to them about the stories of Rwanda. And they were interested. They cared. You think they don't care? I found out when I was in China that when the earthquake hit Japan, Chinese high school kids were doing fundraisers for Japan. I didn't hear that reported in America's media. I didn't hear it on the BBC. But those kids in China, just like kids anywhere in the world, recognized we're connected. We are one race. We are the human race. I didn't know we'd get to travel to Poland, or in a couple of weeks we get to go to Moscow and tell these stories of Rwanda. I didn't know, nor did I know that perhaps those tapes in this book would also be a tool we could use to help the people who are denying genocide. I don't want to fight them. But I believe that as we open up the truth will speak. We don't need more enemies. We have plenty of enemies. We don't need to make more enemies. We want to learn the backstory behind it. And so Teresa and I came. In the next picture, you'll see our kids spent 4 years growing up in Kigali, a wonderful place to raise children, playing with the neighborhood kids for hours on end. And you see in the next picture, well, they kind of stood out in the neighborhood. But nobody held that against them. Look at the next picture. Sean would always be there playing with his friends, huh? He's out there barefoot in his shorts, scabs on his knees, and they've been playing. Today, Dad, we went to Melindsay's aunt. In fact, in the next picture is, I don't have Melindsay, but the boy to the far right is Comrade. Comrade and Melindsay were good friends with our boy Sean. They'd lay on the living room floor playing Legos. They'd watch Sesame Street videos and come home from work and they'd say, Dad, we went to a funeral today. And I'm like, really? Yeah, Melindsay's aunt died. And well, what was the funeral like, guys? And they would tell stories. And for 4 years, our kids were not just playing in the neighborhood. They were making deposits in the hearts of the moms and the grandmas of our neighborhood. Because as kids play together, our hearts get tied together. And in the next picture, you get a view, that's kind of, it's a little hard to see, but those of you who know Rwanda, you recognize that the round point there in the top of the picture is the new American Embassy. And sorry, Zach, just off the picture is the library. And just back here in the bottom right hand, just to the left of where it says Google, Village Urugwiro, you know that part of Kachiru, that's our neighborhood. And so in the next picture, as you zoom in, you come a little closer to our house. Right here. And you see all around our house are little mud brick tin roof homes. Homes of people like Melindsay and Comrade and the others. And then there's larger modern homes. We heard the explosion when the plane was shot down. We didn't know what it was. It was loud. And yes, the gunfire started right away and the roadblocks came and our neighbors down the street, some of the first ones to have their lives taken from them. And her body, I used to say carelessly draped over the fence, but perhaps it was intentionally. Perhaps it was a warning. And we watched them walk down the street in front of our house with the furniture of the neighbors. And that night, Thursday night, April 7, the Interahamwe came to our gate. And we never knew about it until Friday morning. Because out of those little mud brick tin roof homes, women came. I think I have a couple here in the next picture. Boy, if we dim the lights for a minute, I want you to see these ladies' faces. And these are the women. Remember I said our kids were making deposits in the hearts of the moms and the grandmas in our neighborhood. And these women courageously came and they stood up and they said, no, you can't go in that house, they said. Their kids play with our kids. Middle of the night, we need to go to the hospital. We knock on the door and they'll take us to the hospital. Little neighborly acts of kindness. And these women, not armed with weapons, not armed with guns. And so many people think, well, the answer is more weapons and more guns. And that just brings more weapons and more and bigger guns. No, they were armed with the most powerful tool we've been given. They were armed with stories. Stories about our family's interaction. Stories that somehow connected in the brains of those young men armed with machetes, blood on the blades, perhaps their pants barely pulled up from what they've been doing in the neighborhood, young men who are ready to rob and probably do worse in our house. And something in those stories, something in the courage of those women standing up changes the way they think, feel, and act. And they go by our house. So before Teresa and I ever made the decision, because on Thursday the American Embassy was saying no evacuation, we're going to stay, keep your heads down. The RPF will take over the city in just a couple of days. It'll be more dangerous to evacuate than leave. And then, of course, Friday, that story changed and no, we're evacuating. But before we ever decided that we would evacuate, our neighbors courageously stood up for us. And so Teresa and I, largely based on a young lady who lived and worked in our home and a young man who came in the evening as the watchman, we made the decision that I would stay and she and the children would go. In fact, in the next picture there's Teresa and Melindsay's grandma, Comrade's grandma, another one of those women who stood there with us. I wanted just two short little pieces here and then we'll finish. I was kind of wrapped up in my story at the beginning. Did I really thank you guys for this opportunity? I'm really glad to be here with all of you. Man, Jim, I want to sit in your class. And the other professors, the stories you've shared with us and this community together tonight, thank you so much. This is called the first morning out, and this will just give you a little feel. For some of you who weren't, for some of you who were, you'll recognize the familiar things. But after being trapped in the house basically for three weeks, the government said nobody out, and finally they start to lift the curfew a little bit, and I'm heading to Renzaho's office. I'm heading there to build a relationship that I don't know is going to actually end up in me being able to make a difference in several orphanages and for some lives. Well, some people here this evening, I'll talk to you about them in a moment, but this is my first day out, and I'll just jump in here. I backed the car down the driveway. Dawson is with me. Dawson worked with me in ADRA. I was the director, she said, of the Adventist Development Relief Agency. Dawson was with me. Pastor Soraya, the treasurer of the Adventist Church at that time. I'm sure, our Rwandan audience knows here. Some of the others might not know. The Adventist Church was the largest church, the largest Protestant church in Rwanda at that time. The Catholic Church, of course, by far the largest, the Adventist Church. And sometimes I say that and people are like, wow, that's fabulous. And I say, well, not really. Because not only as an international community did we fail, but as a religious community we failed. As a church community we failed. We did not live out what Jesus said, which was love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. We didn't. Some did. But corporately we didn't. We're backing down the driveway. Dawson and Pastor Soraya are in the car. It was a dirt road back then. We knew that the first roadblock was less than 100 yards from our driveway. This barrier was operated by the Taylor man, a man I had waved to several times a day for the last couple of years while he busily worked on his front porch with a foot-powered sewing machine. He always seemed like a nice, gentle guy. And it was strange to see him by the barrier with a weapon in his hand. He led us through without much trouble, though. But our troubles began at the next roadblock, another 150 yards down the road. There were two barriers at this intersection, one to get into the intersection and another to get out of the intersection. And we had quite a long discussion to finally get through the first one, and then to get to the second one, it was even more difficult. It was a rainy morning. Some of you remember those dirt roads and the rain, and the cars almost slid into the barrier. You know how those roads would get. And we were there for probably well over a half an hour trying to convince them that, no, we don't have a laissez-passer. We're trying to go get one, and I won't go into that whole story. But what was interesting was that when they finally let us through the barrier, and I got through, the corner and the gravity was too much, and my little Toyota slid into a ditch. And what do? I did what I'd done for 4 years. I looked for help. Where did my help come from? The barrier that was just hassling me. The guys at the barrier see me slide into the ditch, and what do? They come running down the hill towards me. Where is it? Right here. Let's see. I quickly lost, the front wheels were spinning and there's no way. In times past, pushers always seemed to materialize when needed, and today was no exception. Just like old times, a gang of guys came running happily down the hill shouting, "We'll help, we'll help." I shook my head in amazement as I watched them come from the very barrier that had just hassled us so much. If I didn't act quickly and pick 4 of them, the whole gang was going to want payment. And well, they pushed the car out of the ditch. And we go on through many more barriers, and I'll finish with this one. The rest of the barriers were uneventful. We explained the same thing each time we got to the barrier. We were going to town. I was the director of ADRA. At one roadblock, Pastor Soraya started to explain to the man who we were, and the guy growled, "I don't care who you are. I just want to see your ID cards." Yeah. And the reality of our situation comes back. I didn't know it at the time, but this was the beginning. For so many, their ID cards decided whether they walked through the barrier or were murdered on the spot and added to a lifeless pile of bodies. Built a relationship with Colonel Renzaho, who is now serving a life sentence in prison for his crimes against genocide and humanity, inciting mass rape. building a relationship with a young man named Jaguar, a young man, Rasta man, in the center of Kigali. They kind of controlled this intersection. I exchanged money with them. I gave them US dollars. They gave me Rwandan francs. The women at the market would tell me who they got their powdered milk from. I would meet those thieves. I would buy powdered milk from those thieves. Where could I take the powdered milk? I'd buy like 15 cases of it. If I took it home, they'd rob me. If I took it to the orphanage, they'd rob me. I took it to Renzaho's office. I said, sir, I need storage space. He gave me storage space in his office. And so I'd take it one case at a time to the orphanage. And if we had more time, I would tell you about that day when I actually approached him and asked him to help me get what I thought were 7 friends in Nyamirambo Church. And in the end, well, you can go ahead. Would you bring up the lights just a little more for us? In the end, there were actually 12 people that day. That another Major Emmanuel, who I had met 2 weeks earlier, I brought a guy's 90-year-old grandpa who was in a wheelbarrow. I took him to this other Major's house. And it's interesting, the people you meet and the next one you meet and the relationships and how you move through this time. It was about building relationships. And tonight, John and Lillian, where are you? John and Lillian were hiding in that church. Stay there for just a moment, standing. Lillian was pregnant at the time. And the orphanage around there. Grace, you're out here somewhere? Grace, where are you? There you are. Grace, if you don't mind standing for a moment. She was at Nyamirambo Orphanage, and I don't mean to put you on. Are there some of the rest of you? There was a young man just telling me stories before who were at Gasimba Orphanage. For those of us who bonded together through these, yeah, there you are, I thought so. For those of us who bonded together through these things, and Grace I didn't even know until last April, and I'm so happy we got to meet in April and stuff. But we're family. Thank you. You can sit down. So I proudly tell people that I'm connected. Okay, I'm not a citizen yet. Maybe, Mr. Ambassador, we could work on that. But I proudly tell people I'm connected to Rwanda because, yeah, there's some fabulous, generous, compassionate, courageous, resilient, heart-filled friends of mine, family of mine in Rwanda. And there's many more stories for us to learn as we move on through this journey. It's not over, we know that. But as we come together as a family, as we come together as a community, as a global community, we gain courage from one another. We realize that there is power in stories. There's power in service. And if you'll just indulge me, one last little one, this is where we'll wrap it up. It's called, this little chapter called Tryphene's Eyes. I arrived at Gasimba Orphanage. For those of you who may not know Kigali's story much, this was the biggest orphanage that I worked with in Nyamirambo. Really horrible. I mean, the whole city was in a mess there that was controlled by the genocidal government. But in any case, when I first got there, there were little graves. The kids were dying from diarrhea and dysentery. They didn't have enough water to drink. But I arrived at Gasimba Orphanage with medicines for Tryphene, the orphanage nurse. I didn't know that she'd been taken and killed 2 days earlier. Where's Tryphene? I asked the first person I saw. They looked down at their feet and wouldn't answer me. I asked somebody else the same question, Où est Tryphene? Qu'est-ce qui est passé? And I got the same response. I remember thinking, my French isn't this bad. What's going on? And then it finally dawned on me that she was gone. I had never imagined that Tryphene could be killed. It might sound strange, but she was such a core part of the orphanage that I just never thought about losing her, much less whether she was Hutu or Tutsi. Tryphene was kidnapped from the orphanage on the same Friday as the Sainte Famille Church massacre. And her kidnapping dealt a huge blow to the orphanage. Even though Tryphene was the only medical person at the orphanage and had been there for many years, she was more than just a nurse. Her positive spirit and demeanor brought hope and courage to those children when they needed it most. She had undoubtedly forged deep and intimate bonds with the pre-genocide orphans. And I'm sure that the children who came to the orphanage during the genocide made instant connections with her. Tryphine's loss seemed incomprehensible both to me and everyone else at the orphanage. 10 years after the genocide, I finally learned what happened to Tryphine. I was told that during the genocide, the Interahamwe in the area would bring their wounded to her for medical treatment. I could not understand how Tryphine could treat the people responsible for turning the children she comforted at night into orphans. How did she do it? How could she stand to touch their skin, to breathe the air contaminated by their stinking drunken breath? How could she bear to disinfect and bandage the wounds that these murderers sustained while committing their filthy acts? Answers to questions like these are sometimes years in coming, if they come at all. On the day she was taken, the militia arrived and demanded her help in treating one of their wounded men. As they ordered her inside their vehicle, her husband looked out from his hiding place in the orphanage and caught a glimpse of her climbing into the back of their truck. A few of her own children watched her drive away as well. And that was the last time anyone at the orphanage saw her alive. No one at the orphanage knew what the last precious moments of her life were like. Only her killers knew that. As I write about Tryphine, I think that it's very possible that she did what she did because she was forced to. But knowing her for the few short weeks that I did and seeing the compassion in her eyes, I think she went beyond simply forced acts of medical treatment. I think she saw those killers differently than most of us did, and I think the secret was in the way she looked at people. Perhaps that's what enabled Tryphine to care for both the killers and their victims. Perhaps she saw those young militiamen in the same way she saw the children at the orphanage for so many years, as if they were her own. I'm jealous. I want to see the way she did. I want her eyes. This evening, we've been wrestling between clapping and waving. I want to just raise my hands to you and ask you to raise your hands with me as we commit to journeying on physically, spiritually, emotionally, to building peace in a world where peace and service, stories and service really matter. We can. We're surrounded by an incredible crowd of witnesses. We can. Thank you very much, and God bless.